Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us today in the second session of AI Design Frontiers with our guest today, Joshua Vermillion, in a talk about AI and creativity.
Again, thank you very much to the hosts for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming, and look forward to a very productive conversation. I'm going to start with some sort of higher level overview, starting at maybe 30,000 feet in the air, and slowly we'll sort of zoom in onto specific technologies and how I and others are using them to augment our creative processes. I find that this is helpful to sort of provide some context, as well as to maybe point those who are interested to particular authors or scholars that you could delve into deeper, after the conversation, post-conversation. So I'll start with what is AI, which I don't think necessarily gets enough. Let me just see if I can move this part of the Zoom thing off my screen here. Can't see my cursor for some reason. But anyway, this is from, it's covered up on my slide, from a cognitive scientist named Margaret Bowden from the UK. And she simply states, artificial intelligence seeks to make computers do the same things that minds can, that the human minds work. So she comes at this from a sort of scientific, cognitive science background. So she's thinking about how human brains work, and then also trying to better understand or apply these lessons to how we make intelligent machines. So I think it's kind of an interesting vantage point, not necessarily from somebody who is a creative, but somebody who does think a lot and write a lot about these sort of topics that definitely pertain to us. So I'm just going to try to get my mouse to cursor to pop up here. I have part of the Zoom interface like in the way of my slides, and I can't minimize it. And I can't seem to do that. For whatever reason, I can't see my
Do you need help?
my mouse.
Try to stop the share and try again.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, take your time.
Share sound, background, okay. And I'm going to go ahead and, minimize this. Okay, perfect. So let me just bring this back up. Sorry about that. So let's move forward to Stuart Russell from UC Berkeley. He's talked a lot about artificial intelligence. The way he defines artificial intelligence is a little different. He's thinking about it as a sort of scientific model. Artificial intelligence, of course, is about making intelligent machines, as you would imagine. But then this sort of definition pops up, and I think it's really helpful to sort of better understand that there are, objective criteria for understanding if we're actually, what artificial intelligence might actually entail, right? So he talks about machines that are intelligent to the extent that their actions can be expected to achieve particular objectives. All the other parts of artificial intelligence that we think of now when we talk about machine learning, being able to think, being able to reason, being able to plan, these are all in service of this sort of intelligent behavior, achieving specific objectives, meeting expectations. All right, so now we again can zoom in to sort of thinking about artificial intelligence as a large umbrella, a much smaller umbrella inside of artificial intelligence, of course, is machine learning. And then if we think about under this larger umbrella of machine learning, an even smaller umbrella, generative AI. And this is what I think a lot of folks just sort of colloquially refer to as AI. But this idea that it's still sort of referencing this artificial intelligence, but it's generative artificial intelligence. And I always come back to this quote from Benjamin Bratton, this article he wrote for the New York Times 10 years ago now, when he's talking about intelligence and our the way humans sort of look at intelligence, and the fact that we tend to sort of move the goalposts when we look at artificial intelligence. For instance, we try to define artificial intelligence based off of our own understanding of intelligence and human intelligence. And he sort of holds a mirror up to ourselves as humans, as humankind, as a species, and sort of asks us to think about, well, maybe there are other types of intelligence and even the types of intelligence that we wouldn't even necessarily understand. So he talks a lot about this idea that if we only compare artificial intelligence to human intelligence, we might be seriously disappointed. And in fact, it can be quite useful whether or not it mimics our intelligence or if it's a different sort of intelligence, which I find kind of an interesting shifting in vantage points, right? It's sort of, again, he sort of talks about our pre-Copernican view of the whole universe orbiting or sort of spinning around us. And then after we, after Galileo sort of, looked at things through a telescope, we realized that we're just, we're one planet of many, sort of spinning around a sun, spinning around a galaxy, spinning, etc. So this idea that this sort of human-centered ideas of intelligence are maybe the wrong way of looking at artificial intelligence. So with that, I did want to just sort of touch on quickly how we sort of think about intelligence and how we, when it comes to AI, the sort of types of intelligence, starting with general intelligence. You talk about or you hear about artificial general intelligence. This is sort of thought of as the sort of holy grail of artificial intelligence, right? The goal of general purpose AI is one that's capable of quickly learning high quality behavior in any task environment. In other words, it meets and then exceeds human intelligence, including things like situational awareness, and being able to sort of weigh pros and cons, etc. Which is interesting, right? And you hear artificial general intelligence come up in a lot of conversations. I'm of the opinion that the folks that sort of make promises that we're really close to getting artificial and general intelligence say those things only because they're trying to raise another $1 billion in order to train the next model. So I think they're over-promising in ways that help them try to leverage those promises into more funding. Stuart Russell, I think, has his feet firmly put on the ground, and he says, no, we haven't achieved a general intelligence, not with large language models like ChatGPT. ChatGPT model, GPT-like models, generative pre-trained transformer models, they're probably a piece of this sort of larger general intelligence puzzle, but we're not even really sure what shape or piece the overall puzzle, this piece goes into, right? So, and it's really interesting how he talks about how the large language models in particular are sort of engineering feats, accomplishments without the sort of scientific underpinning to understand what's happening inside some of these black boxes that we've created. And so therefore we can't really know exactly how this sort of fits into a larger sort of general intelligence model that we are trying to achieve. But enter a lot of the tools that came on board commercially in summer of 2022, like latent diffusion models like DALL-E or Midjourney or later Stable Diffusion. They're very narrow in their capabilities, their abilities. So we call that a sort of artificial narrow intelligence, right? So here's an example, of course, Midjourney is very good at sort of denoising static or Gaussian noise into these images that we see here based off of natural language prompts. So we describe what we want to see, and then it sort of gives us a set of 4 images each time we click the button to generate, and we get some outputs. Right. So. And I think what's interesting about this is it took a lot of people by surprise. I mean, there's this sort of meme going around where everybody talks about how we wanted artificial intelligence to do our taxes or, automate some of the chores around the home, like washing the dishes or doing laundry. We didn't want it to do art. And so this idea of generative versus creative, right, I think is kind of interesting. And it really talks again and has brought to the forefront this idea of what is creativity. When we start talking about what is creative and what isn't creative, then we have to sort of find ways to, I think, hopefully distill, our thoughts about what creativity is and isn't. And so let's talk a little bit about creativity. Again, I return to some great scholars, if you're interested in this topic, to sort of, again, go back to some of the seminal text to sort of read on, but I'll just sort of clip some highlights here. Margaret Bowden again talks about creativity as the ability to come up with ideas or artifacts that are new or novel and surprising and also valuable. And what's interesting about these things is that, if you take those criterion, new, surprising, and valuable, the hardest thing to define is really the value of things, because everybody's values are different. And everybody's value judgments, I think, are sort of there's sort of diversity of thought there. And so ultimately she comes to the following conclusions, right? First of all, she asks, can creativity and computers, what can these possibly have to do with one another? I think for a lot of us that have dealt with design in creativity and digital technologies, I think we've always sort of bridged back and forth between those two things. We don't see them being adverse to each other, but that they can be complementary to each other. There are many intriguing relations between creativities and computers. Computers can come up with new ideas and help people to do so. Both their failure and success of artificial intelligence can help us think more clearly about our own creative powers, which I think is a kind of an interesting take. And ultimately, she sort of punts the football, so to say, and says, well, can computers themselves be creative? It's not for scientists to question. Rather, it's something that we need to debate philosophically, which I think is kind of interesting. My pal Neil H., he writes, a computer might appear to be creative, but can it truly be creative? And I largely agree with that. It does, or it appears to be creative. I don't care necessarily how creative it is or isn't, or if it's just augmenting my creativity. And he flips the question on its head and says, well, how do we define human creativity? Perhaps human creativity isn't some sort of black box, but is really just some sort of straightforward search and synthesis process, just like AI. So I think it's kind of an interesting take here. I would question, whether or not we're even asking the right question, right? Are computers conscious? Are they? No, I don't think so, right? Can they be creative? I don't care, right? Do they help us be creative? If that's the case, then does it really matter if they're creative or not, right? Are they real? If you can't tell, doesn't matter, right? That's my position. I'll move on to just a few more folks before I then start to dive into some creative work of my own. But I'll start with Matthias Del Campo, and I think Matthias will be on one of these lectures, these conversations later on in the series. He's someone who's written and talked and done work in this field for more than a few years, and so I'm always sort of looking at the things that he writes and sort of with a lot of a keen interest on what he's talking about, what he's thinking about. In the weird ontology of diffusion models, Matthias poses a really interesting question. I think you can't sort of divorce from this idea of creativity and AI. He asks, can a neural network truly create something new when it's built upon existing data, right? And that's something that we always return back to in all of these conversations that we have. Folks who are very critical of the technology, folks who are trying to come to creative terms with the technologies, we all sort of have this question in our minds, right? Can you really create something novel or new when it's built on existing data? And of course, we've seen all kinds of weird novel combinations that it makes from familiar things, but I think it's a kind of an interesting thing. Of course, on the other end of that spectrum, he hypothesizes here, the very nature of creativity and architecture is sort of questioned. But he sort of talks about this in several ways, and these two that I've highlighted, I think, are really pertinent to the way I think about these things. For all intents and purposes, the question whether the results are new or not might not be relevant at all, so long as it helps the architect come up with something new, right? A novel solution to a design problem, right? So he's talking about this being a partner that isn't necessarily creating something new for us, but again starts to point us in novel directions that then humans can begin to further elaborate on, ask questions of, and then develop, right? Another pal of mine, Andrew Cudless, he talks about the freedom of incoherence, and he's talking about these images, even though they look like they're sort of fully formed images of things that could exist. When you start to look at them very carefully, there's some incoherency to them. It's a very facile sort of understanding of our environment, of our world, right? It has a very limited understanding. And he talks about resisting the sort of homogenation of architecture if we simply use these tools and they become overfit and start to improve their model coherence. In other words, we kind of like the incoherence because They remind us of sort of the incoherence of sketches where we're thinking, and really they just become the seeds of a sort of larger, longer process, right? So the work produced with generative AI is not a finished outcome, but really just a starting point, just like a sketch, to help explore and expand the design space of possibilities. Right? And then another friend that his work I think really sort of exemplifies this. Corey Beig at the University of Texas, he does these emergent collages with generative AI, and he does these a lot of times with students and workshops. What you see here is again very much a collage, right? You see a bunch of weird, novel combinations of familiar things at different scales, and sometimes the scales aren't even clear, right? You look at some piece and you think it's a certain scale, like an urban scale, and then you look at others and it looks like an architecture scale. Or so again, this idea that it starts to help us sort of see things in novel ways, even though this is basically a sort of combination of its understanding based off of existing training data, all the images that it could be scraped and that are ordered with information. So but you can see this sort of really lovely sort of combinations of scales, textures, colors, familiar objects sort of mashed up into really interesting ways. Again, not something fully formed, but basically a starting point, a way to sort of tease your imagination, if you will. So I'll just sort of dive into now the way I sort of approach these things. And for anybody who's experimented with generative AI, I would sort of posit this as the sort of mantra, right? You get exactly what you ask for, but probably not anything what you really wanted. And so, to me, I think that's the question here. How do you take advantage of that generative capacity so that this is actually a feature and not a bug, right? It takes a different mindset to sort of approach this, and it's only applicable to certain things, I would think. But for those of us who use these large language models, I remember the very first time I experimented with Midjourney, for instance, the effect that it possessed some sort of precognition, that it was sort of magic, and with ruthless speeds could sort of generate images of just about anything I could express with words. Um, there was something really, I think, interesting about this, and sort of saying, well, does it have answers? But when you start to use these things and push these tools, I think we tend to do, and as designers, we try to sort of misuse or repurpose tools and push them to their limits and try to break them on purpose to try to understand them, come to creative terms with them. Over time, we see that any kind of wisdom is really more of sort of the model being very naive, right? In fact, it sort of we start to understand it has a very limited understanding of our world based off of just its training data. And so we start to see the limitations and see how it combines things in weird or uncanny or even idiotic ways, right? It sort of does things without the sort of semantic understanding of what we're asking it to do. Um, so rather than an oracle, I would call it a savant. It's frighteningly good at drawing materials, effects, and atmospherics, even if the model has no idea what materials or effects or atmospherics even are, right? Again, it's a sort of semantics that it lacks, is where maybe our imagination can then take over. But again, it's very good at drawing these sorts of materials, effects, and atmospherics and generating a number of things. And so here's where I started with generative AI, these sort of hanging installations that are just basically aggregations of small parts that are then form a sort of larger systemic whole, right? So this was Midjourney way early, like maybe version 4 back in, I don't know, autumn of 2022 or maybe late autumn of 2022. And the reason why I went this direction was because these are AI, right? These are generative AI from Midjourney. Because this is not. These are photographs. These are, installations and work and design work that I had a part in designing, fabricating, assembling, and installing. And so, taking again, another photograph of an installation that we did with in partnership with Philip Beasley out of Toronto. But these ideas of taking these components and creating these sort of immersive environments is something that's always been near and dear to me, and manifesting those not just virtually but physically, tangibly. I think is really interesting. So these are photographs, and then again, here's the sort of ideas that you can quickly generate before you start to invest in material, start chopping things up with laser cutters or table saws, and start to put things together. Before you even start making material waste or spending money, this is a mid-journey image of thinking about these ideas. Or this one, right? These sort of textures of remaking these plastic straws into clusters that then, examining texture and material and light and scale, right? So these are AI, and then again, returning to some of the things that I've worked on physically, right? These are photographs again of real installations of pieces and parts that sort of aggregate together into larger systems. Those are real pedals and hinges and LED lights. And then back to this sort of idea of how can we use generative AI to quickly brainstorm, to start to tease the sort of design space quickly for particular effects, lighting effects, color effects, material and textural effects, spatial effects, especially atmospherics, lighting, etc. Right? So and scale, right? Scale relative to the human being and to the space that surrounds us. And so you sort of get these ideas. Again, this is back to generative AI and sort of the experiments, the sketches that I post on a daily basis, as I try to not only experiment on a daily basis and come to creative terms with these technologies, but then also sort of post an archaeological record on social media, so that years from now I can go back and sort of track how these things were going, how they progressed. And so anyway, I'll just sort of go through, but you can see that, I can take really novel ideas, strange ideas that I normally would sort of rule out immediately in my head. Now in natural language, I can sort of thumb them out on my smartphone, and come back later and sort of see, how a silly large paint splatter against a wall might look, or, that's way too large, right? Or things that are out of scale, or things that are too intricate, or but what you can understand also is that while it looks really sort of neatly resolved, when you look at some of the details of these images, right, you understand that the images are really quite facile. They look neatly resolved, but they're really kind of superficial. There's all kinds of things that assumptions made that don't really add up, right? And so again, this idea that we normally my digital tools, right? Let's say it's Grasshopper or Revit, or, these sort of parametric design tools, virtual modeling, building information modeling. Those are usually very precise tools. They help me resolve ambiguity. They help me manage complexity with precision. And AI is something completely different from all of the other digital technologies I've used. It's not precise. Rather, they generate ambiguity and precision. Perhaps it's there to help us sort of sharpen our language, to sharpen the ideas, or to help us sort of ask different questions, which I think is a different shift in how we typically think about digital design technologies, right? All of the others that came before were always very precise, right? They had things locked down. You need to come prepared with a sort of well-defined problem for them to help you with. Here, you can start talking about very broad problems, very general language, and perhaps these models can then sort of point you in lots of different directions, right? So it's very much not a tool to help you sort of with divergent thinking rather than the convergent thinking part of design. And so you get really strange and magnificent things that might not be practical at all, right? This idea of creating interior space out of the fluid geometry of paint, or whatever, right? And so the diffusion model doesn't think like we do. And I think that's exactly the point, right? I don't necessarily need a tool that thinks exactly like me. If it's going to be a creative partner or interlocutor, then I want it to sort of think differently than I do, to make me think about my own ideas differently, I think is a hopeful thing, particularly early in the design process. And so, again, I try to be as objective as I can be when it comes to these things. It doesn't seem like an optimal way to sort of work to just constantly seek happy accidents. However, the main affordance of these tools is speed, right? So within a very short amount of time, maybe even minutes, you can generate hundreds of different options, right? And then when you combine that speed with its ability, these models' abilities to make just absolutely spectacular visuals of forms or textures, lighting, atmospherics, right? You can start to see that really the problem is one that shifts to being able to sort through all the noise and find signal, right? Our critical thinking skills are matters of taste and style, and being able to sort of weigh pros and cons, the situational awareness that we have to begin to look at different scenarios and see what the trade-offs are. Right, that becomes a very important strategic part of design that's still human and still can't be automated. But what about the idea of craft? And that's just something that comes to mind when I think about creativity. This word of craft or skill, being able to wield these tools with some sort of uh, literal or maybe conceptual dexterity. Is it craft if anyone can do it? If anyone can pick up these tools and start to write things out and make images, does it take skill development? Does it take careful practice? Does it require talent? And I think those are really interesting questions, and some that again, these are questions that I'm grappling with all the time when I'm using these tools and experimenting with them, and new tools come out all the time, of course. But I would argue ultimately, and yes, to all three, and so I have to sort of take you through some of my own workflows here in just a minute. I would say that the human still creates a set of creative burdens in the process, both of imagining ideas, but then also how to describe those ideas. In fact, this is the first time I've actually gotten my architecture students, I'm a professor, to actually want to write expressively about architecture and space and atmospherics, and then to iterate their writing, because they can generate images with it, but at the end of the day, I really love the sort of ways they write then now about their goals and their desires, their concepts. And so I think that's a skill that it's still a skill and it's still creative, this form of writing. But at the end of the day, I would say as more things become automated, I think we need to lean into the things that are innately human, that can't be automated. Things like, how do we curate results? How do we understand what we select? How we provide direction? That involves critical thinking, it involves taste, it involves this is a notion of thinking about the design process as an iterative one, right? And in fact, these tools really sort of ramp up that idea of iteration, rapid iteration, and which ultimately, when you generate lots and lots of things, ultimately comes down to, well, how do you then sort through them, select, and then use those as inputs for the next iteration, right? And so, I think, again, if we approach this in the right way, I don't see us being replaced by artificial intelligence at all. And in fact, I would put this statement out here, and I think we would all maybe hopefully agree with this. I don't think it's controversial at all. Designing something as complex as architecture still requires substantial human input. I don't think that's gonna change. Design is way more than just a few flashy, quick images. Even if we took one of these images and it became very derivative of these images, trying to make something that looks just like these images, trying to actually translate this into materials and trying to make a drawing set that can articulate the design to other humans to build it, that's still a highly transformative and labor-intensive human set of processes, right? Human-based processes. So again, I don't have any problems or qualms with sort of looking at these tools critically, trying to find ways to use them, because ultimately, I don't think that we can design architecture that's delightful and safe and functional for humans without the human touch. And maybe others feel differently, but I would suspect that most of us feel exactly the same way there. If I looked at these two images on the right-hand side, I could probably figure out a way to make that. On the left-hand side, with all where these things, these sort of, and I don't know if they're inflated or if they fill with fluids or whatever, that would be much more difficult. But the translucency, the colors, the suppleness of the surfaces, how they work, and all the textures involved, that would be very difficult. But regardless, it would still require a lot of human ingenuity in creative thinking in order to sort of turn these things into reality. That said, I'm still want to sort of keep my eyes wide open to this idea that using AI and digital technologies, this has been something that's shifting with using the computer and digital technologies anyway. It requires giving us some of the direct control when shaping media, right? But by relinquishing some of this control, we give the tools and the media the space to generate results that might surprise us, that we might not have even thought of, right? So essentially combining our imagination with the latent space can do some, I think, pretty truly magnificent things if we approach things with a critical eye. Right. In a sense, using diffusion model really kind of feels like having your own creative team at your fingertips, ready to brainstorm any idea that you can quickly write down, even from the most normative things to even the most outlandish, right? And like a creative team, I think it kind of is interesting to sort of think about how these things might subvert what you personally were thinking when you were writing down an idea, right? So a talented creative team, you get a sort of variety of experiences, a variety of opinions, variety of experiences that can then generate a variety of outcomes. Now we can be surprised at the results when we start to um, generate with prompts, right? We get these sort of strange interpretations of something that weren't in our brain, but it's exactly what we asked for, not what we wanted, right? Sometimes it gives us these strange juxtapositions. It helps us overcome some of the preconceptions we might have. But I see this as sort of a prosthesis of our intellect or of our imaginations. All right. And you can see again, there's other things to overcome, right? The model, let's say this sort of striated wood space on the right from Midjourney. You look at that and you go, oh, it's another image from Midjourney, right? Eventually, you start to see the biases and from these tools, like a particular model like Midjourney, has these sort of biases and these this sort of aesthetic that always sort of comes through. And sometimes it becomes more fun to try to get something that doesn't look like it came from Midjourney, right? To get it to generate things outside of its own comfort zone, if you will. Um, right. So, but again, experimenting with materials, texture, space, that's something that I've always been fascinated with. And now I can, the first 5 minutes when I wake up, I can quickly do a set of generative sketches with Midjourney or Stable Diffusion and then post them online and sort of have this record of how these things progress and what the machine thinks about these things, not just what humans think about these. What's interesting about that is that more and more social media has become like Instagram, has become less about images and more about human, you know, a human head talking at us, telling us what humans think. And I think what's kind of interesting is to ask yourself, what do the machines think? Can they think? Of course, is the question, but what will they tell us, right? What kinds of things are they capable of doing or not doing? Right. So let's move into some quick workflows and then I'll wrap up. This is an example of a project I did with Samsung, and I was working with a advertising team out of Seoul, and then a creative team out of Barcelona, and I'm on the West Coast of the United States, so we're like 8-hour increments apart on the time zones. It was really hard to sort of all meet up at the same time. We all had to sort of take turns and meeting at inconvenient hours sometimes. But this idea of doing this. Basically a teaser, a commercial, or basically an April Fool's video to talk about their new AI-powered refrigerator. So we took they're building their headquarters in Seoul, Korea, turned it into a refrigerator where you could then type in prompts and start to change the imagery on the outside of the refrigerator, right? These 4-panel this sort of quad arrangement of imagery. And this is what we ended up with. We released this on April Fools, and it was just like sort of false out of home advertising. But it was interesting to sort of think about this idea of what can we really do with generative AI and push it forward. And Samsung, of course, has a budget for this, so it's kind of interesting. I'm just going to play the video now. Right. So it was just enough to get people to do a double take and start looking at this stuff. And so just moving on, this looks kind of weird. It's different than what I just showed before, right? So this was a collaboration I did with Harper's Bazaar, the fashion magazine brand, and uh, what we came up with was doing the first Harper's Bazaar cover and editorial using extensively using generative AI. So I will say that this is a real model. Her name is Maya. She's wearing real wardrobe, real accessories, jewelry. Her hair is prepared in a certain way. Everything else is generated, 100% generated with AI. The rope she's holding, the camel, the robotic wooden camel, the desert scene, the sky, etc. And so this idea of how do we what's interesting is that we talked earlier on in the process with an editor, the photographer, the model, me, and sort of said, well, we're not going to displace any human labor. And in fact, what's interesting about this process is that we kept having to add people because we'd never done this process before. So we actually came up with this really strange, interesting, I would say, transdisciplinary group that came together just for this one project, and then in this sort of strange sort of way. But in other words, I would get images like on the right of the model that the photographer took. So that's a real photograph and with lighting and everything else, just clipping out the background, and then I would do I would generate some sort of environment on the left, and then we would sort of composite things together and then do the lighting and color matching in order to sort of composite them together and hopefully make them feel like we're there. So the idea was to do environments that couldn't possibly be photographed because they couldn't possibly exist, right? So we did a lot of really interesting, sort of try to do some material effects, things that would have been impossible or too costly really to sort of pull off just for a set for photography, fashion editorial. All right, so and then, again, I still experiment with these sort of hanging installations. What I find interesting is now going beyond the static image to being able to sort of animate these things using a host of different other models like uh, Runway, ML, or Kriya, where you can give an image to them, and then it can start to animate yourself. You can start to move the camera through it or around it, pan through, zoom out, zoom in, etc. And so this idea of then giving this more volume and trying to understand how the machine sort of reads these scenes, these tableaux, these images, these static images, and then how it starts to understand how they actually occupy space, I think is also another interesting question, right? And it gets to a larger question of how can we go from 2D to 3D? And I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. But again, these ideas of how can we start to spin ourselves around these things or zoom in or out, I think becomes an interesting one, and one that starts to speak to how these tools might start to connect up to some of our more traditional photogrammetry tools. So we can start to generate multiple views of the exact same scene, then it's just a matter of time before we start to get commercially available tools like that can do the Gaussian splatting that we see NVIDIA working on, etc. Right? So that said, I mean, these tools are not mutually exclusive from all of our traditional tools. This is an example of Midjourney giving me these sort of strange, undulating modules, sort of spatial modules and formal modules, based off of feeding it a bunch of images and sketches that I did with graphite. And so here's another set, right? I gave it a bunch of graphite drawings, and then it sort of riffs and gives me these sort of wonderful, surprising. I was surprised by this. Sort of like the forms become sort of animate. You sort of ask yourself, is that static or is it something that crawls? It does did this wonderful sort of black and white, sort of negative positive space sort of play. So anyway, it's kind of a very, very dynamic set of images compared to what I gave it. And so again, these things can easily feed into the existing workflows, creative workflows that you do in your own design process, and can augment or supplement, the ages-old skills of sketching, drawing, model making, prototyping, etc. Right? In fact, in my studios, oftentimes that's what we'll do. Though my students will make and photograph spatial models, study models and things like that. And then they can bring them in and start to render them in different ways with different materials, different scales, different times of day, different settings, etc., different times of the year. Start to understand what they really have and start to experiment with scale and human occupation, right? They can start to paint humans inside doing different things. But again, this idea that this is from a LoRa model that I trained from a set of drawings that I did, where I was capturing not the system or animal making motion, but trying to actually capture the motions themselves, and then feeding those drawings in to make a LoRa model that I could then start to generate a number of sort of drawing motion, not drawing the subject, but drawing motion, right? So all these sort of strange motion phenomena that now I have a drawing machine, right? I can make a machine that makes drawings for me based off of drawings that I already made. Or then feeding these in and starting to render them out in different ways. These are, again, these sort of strange, uncanny systems that then can be interpreted. These are all generative AI based off of those motions. Then I can start to actually let AI start to speculate on what kinds of strange creatures might have actually created those motions. And for the most part, you see them being in these sort of fluids and starting to translate all of those contours and these drawings, right, as basically fluid and ripples and so suddenly you start to get these sort of strange plants slash animals, and it's not clear whether they're flora or fauna, sort of moving around and tentacles and all kinds of strange things, right? So again, this idea of making the models do things that they weren't necessarily supposed to do, I think is something that we've always tried to do as architects and as designers. Here's another example of that. This is from my friend Arturo Tadashi. So he's a world famous designer. He's done a lot with computational design. He's been fascinated with AI as well. Arturo Tadashi, if you want to look him up. So anyway, he generated a model, a 3D model from an image in Korea, and I'll just sort of show you. He started then to bring, he brought the model into Rhino and started using a clipping plane to cut through it in section and plan. And to his surprise, and I think a lot of people's surprises, there's actually an internal logic. You can see that there's actually like sort of floor plan information in the inside. So it's not just some sort of weird empty cavity on the inside of a shell, but if you look at it in section and plan, it's not a fully resolved section and plan, don't get me wrong. But it's still sort of surprising to see an internal logic that sort of mimics the external logic. And so that's something that came as a huge surprise. And so thinking about how these tools can then be made for designers. This is an example of Kriya, but there's also another web app out there designed by an architect named Carlos Banyan. He's made Formas, if you're interested in Formas, where you can in real time start to sketch and then give it also a sort of text prompt here at the bottom, and in real time it'll sort of generate things for you. Here's just a quick video sort of showing that process, me experimenting with a similar model in Kriya, KREA.ai. So it's saying composed, let's say a spatial installation composed of dense clusters of plastic straws hanging from the ceiling of a tall gallery. Then as I start to draw and prompt it with a sketch with shapes, it starts to then turn those shapes into dense clusters of plastic straws. And then of course the colors start to change as I start to change the colors of the sketch, right? You can start to then have I think a really interesting back and forth with these diffusion models, right? Just as an example. Right, so here's an output from Kriya very quickly. It only took me 45 seconds of just sort of sketching around and playing around, moving things around and editing until I get something that I like just right. So again, when it comes to giving up some of the control, right, I would say that as we've moved through, sort of computer science and brought in more digital tools in the design process, we're kind of getting used to that anyway. We sort of cede some of our direct manipulation of tools. I think about scripting as an example, or parametric design, where we sort of orchestrate all the associations and relationships between pieces of geometry, and then we're just sort of manipulating sliders or parameters, and then all the changes sort of propagate through the model, rather than us just sort of with a mouse starting to model and remodel everything step by step. And so this idea then that this is something interesting. This is like a year old now. Harvard began to give all of their computer science beginning students access to a particular GPT chatbot that could help them when it came to their homework, right? When it came to learning coding and scripting. Um, and so they didn't see it necessarily as something where they were cheating, but really as a way to provide feedback, debug, point people in the direction of where there might be an error or et cetera. But this idea that beyond just making images, again, large language models like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc., not to leave anything out, Llama, whatever, they can try to write code. And particularly when I think about end user coding, end user scripting, right? Or I think about some of the work I've always done anyway in processing, which is a beautiful scripting language made by artists, two artists, Casey Reas and Ben Fry. And so, I love I've always been doing these sort of generative art pieces and projects anyway, using processing and p5.js, these different sort of coding or scripting languages. But now I can also test and see how well a large language model like ChatGPT can do it. So this was written by ChatGPT. This was a quick, have it do some sort of flocking or swarming algorithm. So you can see all of these little plus signs move around like birds, and they start to cluster like bird murmurations, right? Where you can start to give each one a sort of set of behaviors based off of all of its neighbors, the sort of average direction of its neighbors, but trying to avoid colliding with their neighbors and maintaining a certain distance from their neighbors, right? So you can without having to sort of write that code, you can ask one of the GPT models to large language models to script it out with natural language, right? You can say, can you script a flocking algorithm for, let's say, processing or something like that. You can be very, very, very specific, right? You can start to give it the sort of procedural rules and steps. Now it's going to translate that into Python or JavaScript or whatever for you, C#. Right, so you can see there's lots of different examples of me playing around. I'm literally just deploying these on my phone in a little app that's a little processing applet on my phone. Things that have physics or that bounce around and change things as attractor points or orbit or multiply in certain rules. And so you can begin to see that there are lots of different ways now that these tools might help you further leverage computational design beyond just making images. Right, and I think that's an interesting thing. We're starting to see a lot more of these sort of tools. Well, here's one I made, right? Like it was trying to look at fluid dynamics. And then I also actually asked, if you see in the top left-hand corner, to give it a little interface so I can start to scroll through color schemes and then change some of the some of the parameters and how things move and how things are sort of colored according to their rotation angle. Right, so we can start to see a sort of a field effect happening here, sort of gradients of color as well as angle based off of some sort of fluid dynamics. Right, or simply making these machines that make drawings for us. So if we're going to give up some control, then the interesting thing is now how do I make models, but or drawings, how do I make machines that can make drawings, right? And so this idea of drawing machines is kind of an interesting one. I like making drawings so much, now I can make machines that make drawings for me even while I sleep. Like this example, right? Where interestingly, it's moving around a set of arcs and circles, but you don't actually see the arcs and circles, you just see the paths as they draw straight lines. And so you can start to see that there's a logic of just straight linearity built into these drawings. So anyway, or again, another sort of flocking algorithm really quickly, you can start to see how these things, they get in close proximity to each other. But by drawing their paths, now suddenly I start to have a drawing constantly in flux, always changing. And I can snapshot whenever I need a particular type of image or I see a pattern or sort of a larger whole emerging that I find is interesting. Right. So Everybody talks about ChatGPT and cheating on writing essays but I actually have my students use ChatGPT to try to write their own custom Grasshopper widgets, or their own sort of Rhino scripts and things like that, or how to automate something in Revit or Excel or something like that. Um, Right. And so there's a whole host of, I think, starting to become really useful apps that deal with architecture. This slide alone, and the next one, the last one I show, I think is worth just worth this alone, right? If you come back to this, you can start to sort of peek in and then go, okay, there's Blocks, there's Finch, there's Forma, there's Hypar, to name a few, right? There's a set of apps. Some of them are web apps, some of them are freely available, some of them they charge for, that you can begin to leverage machine learning and generative AI, geared towards architects, geared towards the building industry. And last but not least, I will say, it's really up to us. This is a chance for us to have a conversation, right? We are the creatives, and we need to come to some sort of creative terms with this. What kinds of roles do we want AI to take on? What kinds of things do we want to offload and automate, right? And this might be different for everybody, right? But here's a set of possible sort of roles that we can see AI possibly helping us with or assisting us with. Is it a helper? Is it a coach? Is it an agent? Is it a consultant? Is it a co-pilot? Does it just recommend and curate things then on your end to sort of give you a sort of sampling based off of your own preferences and taste? Is it a diagnostic or analyze things for you, debug things for you, help you with problems, help you with resolving or negotiating between a set of competing goals or competing constraints, right? All of these sorts of things, is it a system designer? Does it enhance? Does it mediate, etc., right? I think this slide is really important because it gets to really, I think, the conversation that we need to have, which is what kinds of roles do we want AI to play? And if we can sort of define those roles, then I think we have a seat at the table to help shape our tools. Thank you. And that's the last slide. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and open it up to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua, for such an insightful and provoking talk. We will open now for questions for Q&A. Everyone can share the questions on the chat, and we already started having some questions, but I will start with the first one we received actually in private from Melaz. He or she says, thanks a lot for this generous opportunity. My question is about education, and it is as follows. It makes sense to utilize these tools for professional architects at later and more mature stages. But when it comes to those students who want to start their journey right now and who are not aware of the correct way to utilize the tools, don't you think that these tools will take away a lot from them the thinking and research the student had to do before, which was the exact same thing that to grow their thinking and imagination and skills, and about
Right.
the education?
Yeah, so that's the hard part. It's a tough nut to crack, so to say, right? I saw exactly where that's going because these tools are so useful for somebody who has an existing knowledge base, an existing skills base, an existing set of experiences, right? But how does a beginning student use this stuff without it becoming a crutch? In other words, how does it not take away from their education? How does it not provide just a really lousy shortcut, right? So I don't have a great answer for this, except that actually the first time I was in Saudi Arabia was this past April, and we had a summit and we talked about these things in where was it? It was in Dammam. And so we actually talked about that first of all, we can't make the subject taboo in school. We need to talk about it. And not only that, but we need to have some very clear policies about it. And those policies involve when is it appropriate to use them, when is it inappropriate to use them. But we always disclose their use whenever we use them. And that that we always have a sort of critical reflection whenever they're used on what kinds of things did the model, the diffusion model do, what kinds of things the students do. It's not that we can't just outlaw it. People are going to use it. But the question is, how can we still try to hone in on the students' critical thinking to really sort of think about how they use it and when they use it and what kinds of things that these models can do and can't do, right? So again, coming to creative terms with them is something that's going to happen regardless of how quickly we pivot in universities. It's a great question. I don't have a good answer. I think we're all starting to struggle with these things.
Mm,
But that's the framework I would start with is we need to talk about it. And we need to talk about it and transparently. We need to be truthful and honest about its use. And we need to talk about and perhaps it starts to change. I think about, for instance, some of my colleagues in the humanities or in just teaching architectural history courses that rely on writing. It might actually help us, or we might actually have to start to change the way we structure and scaffold assignments and writing assignments in particular. Um, because the question is, I suspect my colleagues, when they have a writing assignment, they want to hear what students have to say, not what ChatGPT has to say, right?
mm,
And so perhaps there's a way to sort of rethink, what was traditionally a 4,000 word essay or 4,000 word term paper, to think about something that happens in class or goes back and forth or gets drafted so many times. And maybe a part of that process is and includes a large language model, but not necessarily just to make a draft that then maybe gets a little bit of editing and gets turned in, right? So
mm. Uh, Yeah, there's a question from Abir. Most architectural movements start from disciplines other than design, like linguistics, philosophy. If we are confined to AI, architecture will be stagnant in its progress. What do you think? How do you see the future of architecture in this context?
yeah, so that's another good question. Back at the slide where I was talking about Matthias and his question, can AI generate something really generate anything novel if it's based off of all past stuff? And that's a fantastic question, right? Like again, I don't have an answer. I mean, I think that's a question that we constantly have to come back to. And the question that I or maybe how I would think about this, just to sort of reframe it just a little bit is does it matter? Like, I mean, I don't necessarily want to rely on AI for all the ideas, right? Um, for instance, you can just simply type in some imagery or sorry, type in some language, natural language, and let it generate stuff for us. And that's interesting. But at the same time, I'm kind of curious to sort of feed it other things, right? Like I'm a visual person. I like to draw and sketch. I like to get an X-Acto knife out and start to make something and then photograph it and then turn it upside down. And if you can start to feed things into these sort of diffusion models and get different readings, right? And I would think about this as maybe having a tool that can also help us with our critical thinking. In other words, think back when you were in architecture school, you'd have desk critiques and you'd have juries with lots of experienced, seasoned architects and professors telling you, oh, you didn't try this, you didn't try that, you turn it upside down, think it at a different scale, right? Now we have a machine that works for us 24/7 that sort of helps us maybe think about these things as well in different ways. And so my take is that we don't necessarily take anything literally from AI, but that it might actually help us subvert some of the baggage that we always bring with us when it comes to a sort of design concept, and then how do we develop it further, right? So I see these things right now sort of working, sort of helping us diverge and brainstorm and sort of expand our design space, hopefully not in a way that limits us.
Mm. We will take last two questions. One of them is from Andres, says, can you elaborate more on your workflow with ChatGPT with the processing, please?
Yeah,
Also, yeah.
fantastic, right? ChatGPT, I'm sure most, if not everybody here has played around with ChatGPT. But you
Definitely.
have this sort of conversation with the model, and it sort of spits things back. And so all I simply ask it for is can you write a script that does X, Y, Z, or can you write a script for this particular platform or language, right? Like maybe it's Python for or JavaScript, and I can run it in my browser or something like that. And then I just sort of give it some instructions or give it a description. Every once in a while, I'll give it an image of something I've drawn and say, "Can you generate a script that like generates this?" And sometimes, here's the interesting thing, right? One third of the time, and I have to go back and forth oftentimes and tell it, "Oh, that didn't quite work," or "I get an error here or there. Can you fix that?" And sometimes it really quickly fixes something. Other times it rethinks the entire flow of the script. But one third of the time, I get something that just doesn't flat out work. It's just dead. It's not even close. One third of the time, another third of the time, it gives me something pretty close to what I was thinking in my head. But what's really interesting is that last third, where I get something that's not quite what I was going for, but actually much more interesting. So to me, I think it's kind of, again, I have the luxury of being in academia, so I can just sort of experiment, and then happy accidents are appreciated. Um, because I'm not trying to get something very, very specific accomplished. But at the same time, like happy accidents do happen when you work with ChatGPT and scripting. And so I find the process is one that can be creative, where it's not just you going back and forth trying to describe what you need in language, and sometimes you're more or less frustrated with the model understanding you. But if you have an open mind, it can actually start to lead to all kinds of different sort of branching decision trees, right? In other words, you again expand or be pleasantly surprised or be led in a different direction than what you hadn't had in mind originally when you started.
Okay, so let's wrap up with last question. Do you think AI risks lowering the creative threshold where novelty alone gets mistaken for true innovation?
Yeah, that's a good question. And look, you already see it, right? Like if you get on social media, first of all, there's a barrage of generative AI
Yes,
imagery, and a lot of them look the same. You're like, oh my gosh, if I see another sort of wavy thing that looks like it was done by Midjourney or DALL-E or Copilot or
yes.
whatever, right? Like they all sort of have this sort of similar aesthetic. And to me, I think that's something that again, here's how I might sort of say something different now. I think part of that is having these sort of one size fits all products that are commercialized. They're all trained for everybody the exact same way. So what I would recommend is getting under the hood and thinking about how these tools can be customized, right? It's not hard now to, if you have a decently fast GPU in your laptop even,
Mm,
to begin to run these models locally to train with limited data, like a LoRa model or something like that, fine tune these models over top and begin to generate your own aesthetics, begin to generate your own models that can generate things that aren't necessarily the regression to the mean, because that's what I see a lot of right now. It's just like, oh, it's another one from Midjourney. I was like, this is like they're all over the place, right? And I don't think that's really innovative at all, right? I mean, that's just sort of, here's what Midjourney spit out at me. I probably don't even know the first thing about how to make it, but doesn't it look nice, right? So to me, I think that's the interesting question. The other thing is to sort of think about how these might like what kinds of tasks do you want AI to do? And then if you're thinking about machine learning, um, what kinds of data do you actually have, and how much of the data do you have that you could actually train your own model, right? So there are tools that you can use, Lunchbox tools, in Grasshopper. It's a plugin that Proving Ground makes. Will let you sort of train your own model for, let's say, optimizing floor plan layouts or something like that, or automating kind of mundane tasks that could actually be really useful. The question is, how do you begin to curate, structure, and store the data that you make, and how can you use that and leverage it to your own advantage to make your own models that help you, right? So I gradually see this becoming there'll be some one-size-fits-all models that are made for the building industry. But at a certain point, you think, well, maybe they're just, AI becomes sort of these decentralized agents that I have this one, and they learn directly from me, and they actually start to become, quite useful assistants just for me. They would be useless for someone else, but useful for me because they begin to understand the patterns of how I work and the things that I value, right? And so I think right now what you're seeing is an industry in its infancy. Um, but you're starting to see basically just these one-size-fits-all models that are basically like, here's all the data that we had. It was all the images or all of the written words, from history to train with, and we're going to make it commercially available and try to get people to buy it or pay a subscription. But eventually, I think you'll see a decentralization of some of these tools. You start to have your own assistants, your own agents. Um, and two, I don't think it's helpful. The sort of tech bros, as we call them, right? The folks that make these tools and are raising lots of money. Their mantra, they don't think they hit themselves when they sort of insist that we have to throw all of our resources to training these things, right? Like all of our water, all of our energy, all of our money, right? Trillions of dollars, right? And so I think there needs to be a reckoning, a right sizing of the industry. Certainly I think DeepSeek from that team, the research team in China, sort of demystified or sort of broke our mantra of like the bigger the better, right? Like the more money, the more power, the more info you plug into these things, the better they come. But maybe there's again human resourcefulness and ingenuity, and cleverness, and design, can be part of the solution of making these models more useful and less of a crutch, right? We don't want necessarily these things doing everything for us. How can they really assist or augment us?
Joshua,
All great questions.
yeah, thank you, Joshua, again for this inspiring and thought-provoking session. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. This is only the beginning, and we'll continue exploring more and more in the coming AI design frontiers talks. We look forward to seeing you in the next sessions. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
again.
Take
Take
care.
care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.